Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another Shack Attack show. And I think this evening it's just going to be myself um, following the proper social distancing protocols, obviously not in studio this evening, doing the show from home. But we've got an important topic, and I think really quite a current topic, um, straying away a little bit from what's been, um, um, really in the news. So we're staying away from the Black Lives Matter and from coronavirus, and chatting about one of those news items which is always around, but sometimes swept under the rug. And in this case, we're taking a very specific stance, and looking at a very specific issue. And I think then we'll start talking to slightly broader ideals. And I want to introduce my guest to start off. So we have Alan Howitz, who's from the South African Jewish Voices for Peace. We've got Hassan Lorgat, who is a social activist, and hopefully joining us in a bit, provided his internet connection is good. We've got Reverend Ntuthuko Nkosi. And the basis of the topic, and I think to introduce the topic and introduce the discussion, I want to give you a little bit of context into our very own Chief Justice. And I think most of us, in South Africa really look up to the Constitutional Court, to the work they've done, to the role they play in ensuring that democracy functions well in a South African context. That being said, Chief Justice Mogoeng Mogoeng was a participant in a webinar yesterday talking about apartheid in general, but also to a certain extent talking about Israel and Palestine. And this webinar was done through an Israeli media organization, and he was joined by South Africa's Chief Rabbi Warren Goldstein, which is, I suppose perhaps slightly, somewhat out of the norm or out of the blue for someone of his nature to be taking on such a discussion, or at least to be discussing such a topical issue such as the Israeli-Palestine issue, when one supposes that he doesn't necessarily have the governmental imperative, and it might not be diplomatically correct to do so. But I think what was of concern to many of us were the sort of sentiments which he voiced during this webinar. And some of the sentiments one could agree with, that perhaps South Africa has some role to play in the mediation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and things like that. But I think what was most notable and most marked in this conversation was, one, that there was a complete failure on his part to recognize the human rights injustices which are being carried out on both sides of the conflict, but especially in light of current events, on the part of Israel and Israel's part in international law. And we'll get into that in a bit. But so I think it was notable that he was silent on those issues, but also quite, I suppose, perhaps somewhat strange or undiplomatic, that he came out and professed this almost tacit, not overt, not obvious, not extremely vocal, but tacit support for the Israeli state on the basis of his religious views. And he then, went on to expound and quote from the Bible and so on, with little reference to the context which is happening in Israel on the ground, and to the context of the oppression of the Palestinian people. And so that, I think, should be of major concern to many of us. But to unpack this a little bit further, and to give a little bit more context and question what this means from a South African context, what the tacit implications of someone as prominent as a Chief Justice making these sorts of pronouncements, we're going to cross over to some of our guests. And so this evening, as I said before, we have Alan Howitz from the South African Jewish Voices for Peace, Hassan Lorgat, and hopefully Reverend Ntuthuko Nkosi. Alan, you're with us. Good evening. Lovely to be chatting to you this evening.
Good evening to you and to everyone.
Fantastic.
Uh,
Lovely to be chatting. Um, Alan, I'm going to start off with you, and I really want to get a gauge of what your thoughts on the Chief Justice's sentiments and pronouncements yesterday.
well, as I indicated to you, I haven't actually read and I didn't hear the webinar, but the drift of what I've understood is that the Chief Justice was looking at South Africa's potential mediatory role between the Palestinians and Israelis, and secondly, from a Christian perspective, was endorsing a so-called Jewish right to the Holy Land in its current political incarnation as a Zionist exclusive Jewish state, as an ethno-state. And then lastly, that he wasn't questioning the Israeli repeated and historic violation of international law with respect to the dispossession of the Palestinian people from their land, suppression of their culture, and the refusal of the refugees from 1948 and 1967 to return to their homes. So, from my perspective and that of South African Jews for a Free Palestine, that's actually the name of the organization I'm involved in. We believe that he has grossly, I wouldn't say willfully, that might be a step too far, but grossly misinterpreted and distorted the actual position on the ground. I mean, Zionism as a modern political movement started as a very small minority stream within Jewish thinking. I won't go into the details of Jewish history in Europe, the persecution of the Christian church, the Nazi Holocaust. I think most of the viewers will know that history. But Zionism as a practical and moral solution to anti-Semitism has proven to be, in fact, the nemesis of the Jewish people. The Jewish people have encountered, massive tragedies, as I've indicated, and Zionism is now the latest, but it's a self-inflicted tragedy in that the idea that the dispossession of another people can bring safety and security and a new lease on life for the Jewish people after genocide has proven to be a catastrophe, in that the historic burden of dispossessing another people is not something that can lightly be faced. I know as a white South African, I carry, the burden of the past. Whether I personally was responsible for apartheid or not is not the issue. I was the beneficiary of privilege and continue to be the beneficiary of privilege. In the same way that Jewish Israelis, whether they were born after 1967 or not directly responsible for occupation and spoliation of Palestine, also bear that responsibility. Now, the Chief Justice seemed to indicate that his understanding of this history is morally it's equivalent, that Palestinian suffering, because I think he did comment about apartheid, that it is not just illegal but immoral, but that the Jewish scenario, the Jewish narrative, weighs heavier for him in this instance than the rights of Palestinians. So it's highly regrettable, and it certainly showed a lack of understanding or knowledge of what's happening on the ground. Possibly his Christian faith has played a role which is reprehensible, in that the South African Council of Churches and other independent churches have spoken out very strongly and clearly against the impact of Zionism on the Palestinian people, and have not allowed themselves to say that, well, the land where Jesus historically emerged now has to revert to the control of the Jewish people. So I think it's very worthwhile that activists raise this issue and make the judiciary aware that such sentiments go against our own Bill of Rights and our own history. I'll leave it there for the moment.
Later on. So you've spoken to a lot of the points we're going to be speaking to a little bit later on. I think you've given us quite a good summary of some of the problematic issues with what Chief Justice Mogoeng said yesterday, and some of the issues with his sentiments. Now, obviously, I think that the kind of sentiments he brought out are somewhat complex insofar as they have a religious tinge to them, as well as considering that South Africa's relationship to apartheid and Israel's relationship to apartheid and the manner in which he tackled both of those issues. And I think I want to touch on the religious aspect, and I want to touch on the link between Christianity and Israel. And Reverend, we're going to come to you in a second to get some of your sentiments. But for now, I just want to cross over to Hassan and get his gauge on what Mogoeng said last night.
Yeah, I mean, the Chief Justice is an embarrassment. I never thought I'd say that. I'm actually wondering whether we can take him to our own Human Rights Commission for violating the rights of millions of people, right? And that would be quite interesting because he's a Chief Justice, but that's something to explore. I never thought I would say this because our constitutional court, if you rank them throughout the world, is one of the top ones standing for justice. They speak truth to power, and this is what the Chief Justice has failed to do. He is not a mediator, so he's out of his league in the first place. He has been played. That is the truth, because what the Israeli state and their propaganda machine has worked on was that 250 prominent South Africans have said no to the annexation, right? Presidents of this country have said so. Our country has lowered its status relationship with Israel. And what you find, the Chief Justice breaks ranks, right? I don't say he should not talk to the Israelis, but he should keep them to account. Now look at what Bernie Sanders said. When people were protesting, Bernie Sanders says, it's up to us to stand up to authoritarian leaders and to build a peaceful future for every Palestinian and every Israeli. In the words of my friend, Ayman Odeh, the only future is a shared future. This is what Bernie Sanders says, whose family were, I guess, perished in the Holocaust. Now, here you find our guy, right, using our suffering to bet for the Israelis. He doesn't use keep them to a standard of justice, because if you talk to them to say, release Palestinian prisoners, don't do this, this is what we did. Mandela said only free people can negotiate. He doesn't do any of that, right? What he does, he gives them a free pass. And that is why he should be held to account.
100%.
I come to you because I think whichever way we cut it, and I think this is not only common to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it is an issue we see with many conflicts, whether it's Saudi Arabia and Houthi rebels, whether we look at what's happening between India and Kashmir, between China and Tibet. There is this kind of overcurrent of using religion and religious beliefs to justify the unjustifiable. And I'm curious to know what your take is on Mogoeng's statements, especially considering that, he comes out and he quotes from the Bible about Israel and the children of Israel and the nature of the land of Israel. And I really want to know what your take is from a humanist perspective, but also from the perspective specifically of a reverend, and from what your understanding of the biblical perspective on Israel is. Reverend, are you with us? Reverend, did you get that?
Doesn't look like it.
It doesn't look like. Okay, so we'll try and once he's back and once we've sorted that issue.
Aqeel, as the Reverend gets more back into it, let me say, part of the free pass that he gets, he doesn't mention the UN resolution against the state of Israel. He doesn't mention popular unhappiness in America, in Europe, all over the world. He just goes there and says, oh yeah, we can help you. And he hasn't got the ability, because where was he really when it mattered? And when Ronnie Kestrel issues a statement against him, clearly, he's a newcomer in this issue. He should have at least gone to the negotiators. Ronnie Kestrel, Pahad, and others were part of the negotiations in Ireland and places like this. He was not there. I don't know why is he talking about things that he doesn't know about.
Beyond that,
go ahead.
I'm just saying, beyond that, this notion that it's a conflict that can be resolved through mediation, that somehow the Israelis, who at the moment hold the stronger hand, they've got the support of Europe, the EU, they've got the support of Trump, and historically we've seen that negotiation at the political level is meaningless without a grassroots organization and pressure, as existed in South Africa in the 1980s and early 90s, as well as a formidable BDS campaign of outside support. And that's also a grassroots campaign. The interests of imperialism in the Middle East have shown the results, right, that we see today of divide and rule. We can't look at the Palestinian dispossession in isolation from what the Europeans and Americans have done in propping up right-wing sort of crypto-fascist regimes like Assad and others for decades. So without that historical context, to say that South Africa can mediate in a sort of constructive fashion, we've seen in the past that this is absolutely not the case. Mandela's view was exactly that. South Africa could be an honest broker. But the Israelis are not interested in negotiation. I mean, they have shown that over and over again. This annexation is simply the extension of a de facto annexation. The sovereignty as a legal concept will be applied when on the ground daily Palestinian territory is being confiscated, is being so-called bought by all sorts of undercover agencies and so forth. So it's naive in the extreme to look at the Israeli state as being amenable to a bona fide negotiation with respect to Palestinian rights. That our Chief Justice, who one imagines has some political acumen, could, as Hassan correctly
don't give him too much credit,
be used by Israeli propaganda is quite frankly shameful.
Alan, I think you give the man too much credit for having political acumen. When he was appointed as our when he was appointed as our Chief Justice, he was an unknown person, plucked out by someone from somewhere, right? And I think we need to just he surprised himself by doing something good. I just want to end by this before we let the Reverend come in. I want to support South African BDS campaign when they say that the Chief Justice statements must be censured by the Judicial Services Commission, right? That his position there, he's compromising his understanding of justice, right? And he needs to be clubbed very, very hard. Reverend.
Thank you very much. I think, yes, I'm here. I think a couple of things that one wants to respond to. I'm hoping you can hear me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We're good. Yeah.
Sure, you're good.
Especially when you speak.
Okay. There are a couple of things that I want to respond to, especially to what Justice Mogoeng had said. Number one, we as Christians, we are fighting the notion of using the Bible to legitimize the evil doings of an empire. You know, in 1985, we issued a Kairos document, which was fighting the imperial theology. And number two, it was fighting the church theology that at the time, which sided with the apartheid government. So we were challenging the church theology that legitimizes the evil doings of the empire using the Bible. You know, no matter whether you are Israel, you the Pope, or whoever you are, wrong is wrong. And we can't hide behind the Bible. We can't push the imperial agenda using the Bible. That's what we are trying to do. And two, in his response in the scriptures that he touched, you know, when he's speaking of peace in Jerusalem, the question is, who is Jerusalem today? Can you speak of Jerusalem without Muslims? Can you speak of Jerusalem without Christians? Can you speak of Jerusalem without Jews? Can you really speak of Jerusalem, a Jerusalem of one race or a Jerusalem of one religion? How possible can that be? And is peace the silencing of Palestinians? Is peace the absence of noise? Or is peace the salam, the shalom, you know, the pax, you know, the peace of God that surpasses all human understanding? So in his view of scripture and how he used scripture makes me wonder whether are we going to find peace in Jerusalem if the Christians are silenced? Are we going to find peace in Jerusalem if the Muslims are silenced? Is peace the absence of to really touch on the ground, the work on the ground? My last time in Palestine, I served in the Jordan Valley, and the very Jordan Valley that is about to be annexed. And one, if you can get a half cent or 1 cent of the shekel, you will see there is a map on it, the Greater Jerusalem map. And this whole annexation is part to fulfill the Greater Jerusalem map. It's part of the extension of the E1 plan. I feel it's part of that extension of the E1 plan of making the Greater Jerusalem.
So I've lost you. You know, yeah.
Alan,
Yeah.
can you hear us?
Can hear.
Okay, fantastic. So I want to come back to the idea of comes back. I want to come back to the idea of Mogoeng himself. And the question, I think, is this an isolated incident of one prominent South African who chooses to voice his own opinion on the matter? or does it kind of speak to an underlying undercurrent which is starting to run through South Africa, which is that the kind of Israeli influence is slowly beginning to filter into what typically were bastions of pro-justice and pro-Palestinian sentiment?
If I may respond, I don't think that this is something new, in that the ANC from the start, from 94, has never really, I mean, aside from the rhetoric, the rhetorical support for the Palestinian struggle, and this pretense at playing at being a bona fide mediator, has not really forthrightly put forward the fact that the Israeli expansionism, which started in 1948 and has continued ever since, from the initial Nakba, is something that has to be fought in the same way that apartheid South Africa had to be fought. For some reason, we held back, and because of influence, the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, and financial clout, as we've seen with right-wing Jewish billionaires in the United States, the same pattern is played all over the world. We know that money knows no color, it doesn't talk but swears, but it is used as the most powerful political tool. I mean, whether it's Trump and Sheldon Adelson, who's a right-wing Zionist, or in South Africa, we also have examples of the same type of politics. We know that the organized Jewish community did not confront apartheid. There were quite a number of individual people of Jewish background who did, but as a community, it was seen as expedient to go along with the status quo and to benefit financially, materially. Now, it wasn't only the Jewish community that became honorary whites. The Japanese became honorary whites, Portuguese became honorary whites, Afrikaner nationalism and English, if you like, financial power, economic power, co-opted certain other nominally white groups to support apartheid. But this pattern, as it exists in Israel as a colonial state, South Africa has never confronted that with any vigor. So it shouldn't surprise us that people from the ANC establishment, and certainly in the DA, have supported Zionism with the excuse that this is a historic conflict, that both sides have a claim to the same territory and so forth. So I think that the suggestion that the Chief Justice be reported, if that's the right word, to the Judicial Commission would be a very useful step to make public officials aware that there is going to be some accountability when they take such an extreme political position. Hassan, I'm sure you want to add on that.
Okay. Aqeel, the challenge before the Judicial Services Commission is that Mogoeng, Chief Justice, was using an official position to make statements that were in contradiction to the values of our country, as well as the policies that we hold currently, right? It may have been great to say that under apartheid, right? But even, let me go back, even if he said, let us mediate, Mandela said, only free men, only free people can mediate. Only free people can negotiate. He said it to the Palestinians. How many prisoners are in jail? When Mogoeng says the Israeli state, I think he says somewhere, did they steal our minerals? Why have we got contact with the colonial countries? He shows such basic sociological problems, not psychological, sociological understanding. I mean, a first-year student, right, at any university will begin to tell him that he's not analyzing the things consistently. There are over 5,000 political prisoners, including children, women. He doesn't raise their plight, right? When he talks about did they steal our diamonds or did they steal our minerals? If he's really serious, I can offer him a webinar with mining communities. So then we can look at what Glencore and others are doing. Companies that trade in diamonds, that wash them clean in, I don't know which part of Israel. I think it was one of the major in Tel Aviv. That's right.
Yeah, the
right.
diamond
So if you want to talk about that, talk to people who work in these kind of sectors. So he says, why do we have a relationship with our colonial masters, right? Our colonial masters left a long time ago. We're having a relationship that we're structuring with the Afrikaner community that try to monopolize power and the corporations, English and Afrikaans, that were here. We are fighting and talking and negotiating with them to make sure that they come to the party. 25 years since. We haven't stopped doing that. So I don't know, what is he talking about? Does he want us to go back a century, right? And clearly, we need to engage him. He should be on our shows. You should invite him, actually, and put us there to ask him these questions. And if you want to talk about minerals, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, Israel is not only trying to make itself a master around diamonds, they're trying to tell people how their weapons have been tested in real life. They don't say they've been tested on Palestinians. So they then put themselves as masters of technology. They then try to deal with our country around water, right? The other day, an ambassador from Bedouin origin was choke held by, I mean, he's worked for the Israeli state. A Palestinian Bedouin, right, was choked in the same way that George Floyd was choked. So they try to promote themselves as being experts in the technology of repression, right? He's got to talk about that. So they are dealing with our country. We knew during the Fees Must Fall campaign, some of our, I don't know if it's who was using it, but some of the arms, the arm controlled was bought from the Israeli state. So clearly, South Africa has to deal with that. I remember a few years ago, Power FM tried to have the ambassador, and I think they had him on, trying to talk about how Israel is turning a desert into water. You know, they don't talk about how they're stealing the water that's under the West Bank, right? How they ration the water supply of Palestinians while there are swimming pools for Israelis in the hilltops of the occupied, the doubly occupied parts of Palestine. So clearly, Mogoeng needs a real investigation. Firstly, and then with the Judicial Services Commission. And I think because I work with the Human Rights Commission, I'm thinking actually to bring him down to size. He must come answer why he's hurt our feelings by talking as he did, so naively.
Absolutely. I think we can all agree that there has to be some sort of recourse for irresponsible statements, especially from someone who exists in his position and with his stature. But, you know, I think the fact that someone who is in such a high position and with supposedly such good understanding of justice wouldn't make those sorts of comments or hold those sorts of views without some underlying incentive or force or power or whatever the case may be. And I think, Alan, you spoke a little bit to the amounts of money which the Israeli lobby and the Zionist lobby spend around the world. You've talked a little bit about what happens in Europe. You've talked, for example, to Sheldon Adelson and the Trump campaign. Are we beginning to see similar or increasing amounts of funding and influence coming through South Africa by the Zionist and Israeli lobbies?
Well, I think, I mean, in our electoral law, it's not compulsory to name who your donors are for various political campaigns, which is actually something very reprehensible. We should have complete transparency about every cent that every political organization receives. so that we know where these lobbies are coming from and what they're trying to promote. But it can be said with great certainty that the Zionist lobby in this country is using pretty much the same tactics. I'm talking about the right-wing Zionist lobby, right, which controls the South African Zionist Federation and the Jewish Board of Deputies in our country, that they are using similar tactics to Sheldon Adelson. I mean, capitalism all over the world, the fraud of democracy, that this type of representative democracy represents free political activity, we know it's a lie. So it shouldn't surprise us that political support is bought. Now, we do know that the South African Jewish community is a wealthy community. It makes no pretense that it isn't. And if you work within the system and you're successful, well, your ethnic background shouldn't be the issue. But when it's used for political means, as it is in this instance, and to support an apartheid state, then it should be called out. Because otherwise, we're basically saying whoever has the most money wins the political context. And those contests then are actually fraudulent. The democracy itself becomes a sham. Now, it needs us as if you like, a social activist movement, Palestinian solidarity, to raise these issues and connect it with the general political drift in our country, which is away from any real engagement with democracy. So we can't isolate what's happening with Zionism from other struggles that we face.
Alan, Aqeel, let me add a few things. The Chief Justice is out of kill. Aqeel is out of kill with the South African Council of Churches, right, who have spoken in a unanimous voice about how Palestinians have been marginalized and against this annexation, right? He's out of kill, out of line with the constitutional law experts and the lawyers of the country. Nadel issued a statement, right? The Democratic Lawyers Association. They wrote to the president and to the Secretary General of the ANC to say that they dismayed at the recent comments made online by the Israeli, by the Chief Justice, right, on the 23rd. They say further that his comments are unfortunate and repugnant to the values and precepts of the constitutional democracy that we have, international law, and basic human rights. This is now from Nadel. Now, if he's a lawyer, if he's a Christian, Alan, there's one point where I think it's not just money that Mogoeng is into this. I don't think there's money exchanging hands with him. I think he's sincerely wrong, right? They have targeted Christian Zionism, who look at the scriptures there, and as our Reverend tells us, when they hear Jerusalem and that, they start believing the Israeli propaganda, the Zionist propaganda. So there's been a group here targeted firstly through the United States and then throughout world Christianity. So they have Christian Zionists who are so vehemently supporters of the Israeli state. And I think that there's no money changing hands. Maybe someone's making money, but there's this idea where people have been corrupted. And then a number of them also came to our last meeting, Alan, which we had in Mayfair, and people there admitted how they were played. They were played. So really using the Bible, as a reverend who's having a difficulty now on his internet explained to us, they were played and telling them, you see, it's in the Bible. Look at the scripture says this, you know. And that is the kind of propaganda that these guys have targeted. For years, in an area, I live in a small town here, in Indonesia, right? They have targeted non-Muslims, right? Taking them on trips for free holidays. When I worked with the NGO coalition, they even targeted there as free scholarly trips, you know, to the Red Sea and others, offering that. So it's a bribery, Alan. So it comes through in that way, not a crude money thing. They're saying,
No,
come and see
sure,
this
no.
country.
No, I wasn't suggesting that actually the Chief Justice received payments, not at all. What I was saying is that the general tenor of politics globally is for the Zionist movement, like many other political movements, is to buy support primarily from political parties, but also from NGOs. So the pattern of politics of Christian Zionism, I mean, Lord Balfour, going back to 1917, representing the British Empire, was a Christian Zionist. And in the United States, the evangelical movement, which supports Trump, is also heavily invested in Israeli supremacy, so that messianic dreams entertained by some right-wing Christians can be advanced. It's a very toxic mix of different interests, both theological and political. And the result is to give the Israelis the green light to dispossess a Muslim people. I mean, they couch it in those extremes.
Yeah. Ellen, you see this Nadell statement says on the third point, South Africa is a secular state in which the judiciary is enjoined to avoid doctrinal entanglements, that is, religious doctrines, and adheres to basic human rights. Religious interpretation of scriptures, which is based on the beliefs of one religion, was jettisoned in 1994 when our constitutional democracy was birthed. The Chief Justice's interpretations of the scriptures that Israel's referral to in the Bible is the same as apartheid Israel is misguided and incorrect. The interpretation stems from the austere Calvinist doctrines of the Dutch Reformed Church that provided religious justification for apartheid South Africa and bears a strong resemblance to the racist Zionist belief that God ordained Israel, a land without a people, and that's for the Jews, and a people without a land. You know, so then it goes on. It's a really, really useful statement, and I'll post it on for you there. But this is how he's got no support, really, no support.
So I just I think you both speak to something which is very important. One is that there's an enormous amount of money which is used to fund this propaganda. But secondly, and this isn't, isolated to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict specifically. I think it's been done throughout history. It was done by Adolf Hitler in trying to justify the atrocities committed against Jewish people. And that is the co-opting of religion and the selective reading of religious scriptures to support whatever political ideology which needs to be supported. But I think both Hassan and Alan, you've both talked to the kind of infiltration which is starting to happen in around the globe, both from a top-down perspective, so through your big political parties, and through grassroots levels like NGOs. Now, Alan, from what I picked up a little bit earlier, you were kind of speaking to the idea that part of the solution to this problem, part of the solution to countering Israel's propaganda machine, is by doing grassroots work. How is it that can actually continue when you're seeing, like you say, Hassan, young prominent kids, especially from underprivileged backgrounds, especially who have some sort of political, lower level political clout, being sent on these lavish trips to Israel, and then having big parties funded by the Israeli lobby. So how do we start a grassroots level organization when the Israeli lobby is managing to pump so much money into countering that grassroots level organization before it even gets off the ground?
Yeah, Alan, you want to go first?
I think that, South Africa has changed so much in the last 25 years that we've had social movements, but we haven't really had a united front of these movements, something that can pull together all of these different struggles including our international solidarity work. So we are on the back foot. I mean, that's a regrettable tragedy. The historic task of the trade union movement and the civic movement to be the voice and the conscience and the feet of the working class. And I use that term, which has become, we talk about the underprivileged. We have all these different euphemisms for what is essentially a class struggle with very deep racial overtones. But we've lost our way politically. So it's very difficult for us to really be effective when it comes to solidarity. I mean, I don't want to digress too much, but look at Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a country in deep crisis for how long? And yet, as our neighbors, we are silent. And all that we do is attack Zimbabweans who are escaping from a dictatorship that has destroyed a local economy. So we don't really have the tools at the moment. The new coalition, South African BDS coalition, hopefully can give some new life to this. But unless it connects with other formations, with the trade unions and independent civics, I don't think that we're really going to be able to counter this because we are fragmented and isolated. I'm sure, Hassan, you've got many comments on that.
I mean, I think that, Alan, where we are strong is with people, poor people, ordinary people. In Kenya, I think Ramzi Baroud was speaking the other day with them. So all over the world now, the Palestinian struggle has become the anti-apartheid struggle of our time, right? Where we are not succeeding, Alan, I think, is that the Zionists are going to prominent people in power and influence. So what they do, that's right, like the Chief Justice, or they go to Angela Merkel to say, and then they intimidate the German state, and there you can't say anything. I mean, I was in Germany last year with people who are socialists, communists, people I've worked with. Some of them say in Germany they can't talk about some things because of their own sordid past of how they treated Jewish people, right? So they go to leaders. They go to leaders, and the leaders then pass laws outlawing the BDS movement. I think we have won a lot more popular support, and even courts have overturned that. But what they've done, they pressure the elites, right? But the masses are with the Palestinians. I just want to say here that for me, the difficulty around working, everyone has to be an activist on Palestine because it truly tests our humanity, because whatever we do, the Zionists continue to gobble up the land, swallow the people's culture, kill people with impunity because America allows them to do that, right? So I really think, and it has to change in America as much as it has to change in occupied Palestine and Israel, right? But I think that we have to find a greater connection between what we do every day and stopping the action. Unfortunately, we're managing to convince people and they go on. And then when they are hauled before the ICC, they try to look for ways America must bully ICC. They pass misinformation. They give flack to the commissioners there, But I think that their time is coming, and they will end up saying, like other fascists have done before, that we did not know what was happening. And there's so much information now, they can't run away from it. Nadell says, about our chief minister, what they say, Lastly, they say, Chief Minister should do the honorable thing and withdraw his inflammatory, offensive, and divisive statements which are inconsistent with South African foreign policy, human rights, and international law. Indeed, his statements are inconsistent with the ethos and the office of the Chief Justice and the oath of allegiance to the Constitution that he swore to uphold. So he's got a lot of pressure. I think what we need to do is to keep the pressure there, and if he does not withdraw, there's going to be pressure that he has to resign. He's a young man in this position. They didn't give it to Motseneke For various reasons, he has denied that post. He had to retire. They gave it to this guy plucked from somewhere who now makes the statement. If he does not withdraw, I can see there's going to be a collision cause.
Mm. Well, I think that will actually sharpen for also the ANC its position. At the end of the day, we do need a state which is going to be active in the AU and in other fora in order to put some political pressure. It's not clear what Netanyahu will do on the 1st of July. He's a tactician. So there might be certain maneuvers now because there has been a global sort of condemnation of this idea of Israeli sovereignty over a third of the West Bank, because the world still believes in the fiction of a viable Palestinian state on 22% of what's left of Palestine. So it's convenient for many countries to draw the line rhetorically, but whether they will actually take the step of implementing sanctions, that's still a very big step from rhetoric. So the battle is certainly not won, and it would be useful if our Chief Justice became a casualty of having lent his weight to Israeli propaganda.
Yeah, but you see, Alan, and this is Aqeel, this is the problem, that he had these sentiments all along. He didn't just spring up yesterday, right? He was
True.
there and he was played. He was played at this moment, right? And if they play this trump card at this moment, in an event where they're not going to win, they are losing a powerful ally. But let me tell you, from recent, it looks like Trump and him are not sure how to go, because Bernie Gantz looks like he has said he doesn't want a forceful annexation. He wants a peaceful annexation, whatever that means, right?
Well,
where the guns are hidden. The guns are hidden, I guess, right? But he said King Abdullah II must kind of approve of that, which won't happen. So I think that there's an upheaval where this Jared Kushner is kicked up, right? But our Mogoeng, I don't think he reads nor watches international media. I don't know who's advising him. I think there's a way out for him, is to withdraw and apologize. Then he can have this position for his term. If he does not do that, I think he's going to be out. So I think, Aqeel, you need to talk to Azhar and others on the show. We need to get them the Chief Justice to answer tomorrow morning. Is he going to apologize or not? Because that's what the Israelis do to us. Whenever we say something, it's anti-Semitic. You speak about justice, they put flack on you. We don't want flack on this guy. He has a right to express an opinion. We're saying it's a wrong opinion, right? And he didn't have the authority to speak. If he went there, I don't know, he's resigned. He can't speak as an individual anymore, holding this position. He swore, as Nadel and everyone talks about, he swore to uphold the Constitution and its values and respect the government that put him there, right? So clearly, I don't know what he thinks he was doing. So he has to be asked tomorrow morning by you, by SAFM and everyone else, will he apologize, as the lawyers have said, or not? And then if he apologizes, then the Judicial Services Commission and the other issues can step back. But Alan, here's a question for you. That if you as a Jewish person, and I know you as a comrade, socialist and a poet, if you're so offended, don't you think that we as citizens can say his statements were not helping promote peace, and we want the Human Rights Commission to call him to because he violated, some of our own rights by acting, speaking as a peacemaker for us who don't want him to be a peacemaker in our name.
Yeah, I think you're correct that we certainly should make him accountable for expressing views that actually support a type of apartheid. So there's no question here whether you Jewish, Muslim, or Christian, whether there can be an objection.
But the two organizations, Alan, if PSA with Jewish Voices for Peace and other groups can merge to say we ask the Human Rights Commission to call this guy.
Absolutely. Through, I think we've created a new structure, the South African BDS coalition, and that would be the proper structure to take this forward with its different components. No, absolutely. No, the fact is that the Zionist canard, that to attack Zionism is to be anti-Semitic, is something that has to be faced head on, because it's extremely dangerous for Jewish people. The fact is that Jewish ethics is counter to what Zionism has practiced and continues to. I mean, Zionism is founded on expulsion of an indigenous people, the denial of their rights. Today, there's administrative detention of political prisoners. There's second-rate status for Palestinian Israelis. I don't need to repeat the whole litany of what Zionism has done. As a Jewish person, it is an affront to the history of the Jewish people. If there has to be a Jewish national home, surely some arrangement could be made where no one has to be displaced for such a national home for those Jews who wish to live in a so-called Jewish state, in the same way that a Bulgarian may want to. I mean, the Jewish identity is complex. It's not just a religious identity. I mean, I'm not religious at all. I'm a socialist. I'm an atheist. But I have a Jewish identity because of history and culture. So it's something that, not every identity can be put in a box. But the mistake of Zionism is to put Jewish identity into a box, into a political box, which is repugnant for anyone who holds universal ethical standards. So I think there'd be no problem for SAJFP to join with other solidarity groups to take this up in the way that you've mentioned.
Yeah, Helen, what the Chief Justice talks about? He says that, almost talking about, did they come and take your minerals? Did they do this? He does not recognize the early Zionists who were looking at countries in Africa, Uganda, Kenya, and others, to say, hey, can we put a state for the Jews here? Right? He doesn't recognize that history, and it's there for him to read. So
Absolutely.
I think that even if he apologizes and withdraws, we need to have a teach-in with him.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good idea. Yeah.
So, gentlemen, to the both of you, we have about 2 minutes remaining. And we've kind of touched on the annexation, which is likely to go ahead soon of the West Bank by Israel. I wanted to know, from a practical perspective, from a practical individual, small grassroots scale, but also at a more large global scale, or domestic political scale, what is it that we need to do to try and, I suppose it might not be possible to prevent it from happening, but to at least put pressure on the Israeli government to prevent further annexation?
My take is that King Abdullah II, whom I think Bernie Gantz was saying needs to endorse the annexation, then he will go with it. So I think there are mixed messages, according to the New York Times and elsewhere, about how it will go. But I think what we need to do is to do more what we are doing, double our efforts, make sure that we win more and more support, as Ellen and Emma are showing, in the Jewish community, in the privileged sections of our society, right? Because there are great gains to be made, and make sure that we hold our unity of the oppressed, the historically oppressed, to make sure that people like Mogoeng can't break the ranks. He's like a guy breaking a strike. And Ellen and I, as former trade unionists, that's the biggest insult that you can have. When you break a strike, you're in trouble, man. So he's broken the line. So I think we got to keep doing that stuff. But the Europe, he's got no backing outside the USA and a few states that they pay to do stuff. I mean, even Kenya, as I understand, they told him, no, this is like a no. So I really think that popular pressure will work, and people are converting popular pressure into political power. in votes. And Trump is playing for the 3rd of November, right? Trump cares about nothing really. But I think while we say he's a stupid man, we must not be blind that he's filled the US courts with white men who are conservative and young. So they're changing fundamentally the politics of the US, while the rainbow coalitions on the ground are fighting for Black Lives Matter, for greater humanity. Trump and him, beholden to right-wing politics, they've been making systematic changes to the power structure of the United States. So I think we need to have greater battles and greater alliances in the belly of the beast. Helen.
Yeah, I think that there's one aspect that should be looked at on, if you like, an ethnic basis. The Jewish Board of Deputies has refused on principle to ever criticize what Israel does. They, together with the Zionist Federation, demand slavish adherence to Israeli positions. Now, with the annexation, no doubt, the argument for Israel as an apartheid state becomes more crystal clear than ever before, is that we should look at the legal status of these organizations in supporting an apartheid regime. Now, of course, there will be those that say, well, there are many other dictatorial regimes, racist regimes in the world. Why should Israel be singled out? But at the same time, I think that there's a case to be made that Israeli apartheid is particularly blatant, and that this comes into conflict with South Africa's Bill of Rights. So that's something where we should put pressure on the ANC and other structures to examine how the Zionist Federation and the Board of Deputies, on what basis they can continue to operate freely in this country. Yeah, we've lost it.
It's yeah, so to the both of you, and unfortunately we didn't have too much time with Reverend Nkosi. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope that discussions of this nature make it out into the mainstream, and that we manage to put some sort of pressure on the local South Africans who are supporting, like Mogoeng, who are supporting unjust regimes, but more importantly, manage to develop a significant enough movement to try and prevent Israel from perpetuating its ills. But to the both of you, thank you, Jazakallah, for coming on this evening. And from myself, Aqeel Wadee, that's it for this evening. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you.